It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the city. Maya, a successful businesswoman, was heading to an important meeting. She had spent the last few weeks preparing for this presentation and was determined to make it count. Her black SUV hummed along the busy streets, with the rhythm of the tires on the pavement providing a sense of calm. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. She was running just a little bit late, but she had plenty of time to make it to the meeting. As she drove through the crowded city streets, Maya couldn't help but notice the usual hustle and bustle of the area. People were walking briskly on the sidewalks. The hum of traffic was constant, and the sounds of city life filled the air. She was focused on her thoughts, rehearsing her pitch for the upcoming meeting, when suddenly she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. Maya wasn't doing anything wrong, just a regular drive on a busy afternoon. But the bright red and blue lights behind her were enough to make anyone's stomach tighten. She glanced around to see if there was someone else who might have been pulled over, but no, it was her. Confused, she looked back at the officer in her mirror. The police car was tailing her closely, its sirens now turning on. Maya took a deep breath and eased her SUV to the side of the road, pulling into a nearby parking lot. As she stopped, her thoughts raced. She wasn't speeding, and she hadn't made any illegal moves on the road. The officer's car came to a halt behind her, and Maya sat still in her seat, unsure of what was going to happen next. She quickly rolled down her window, preparing for the officer to ask for her registration and license, like they always did during traffic stops. But when the officer stepped out of her car, Maya immediately noticed something unusual. The officer was a woman. She was tall, with a strong build and a hard expression on her face. Her uniform was crisp, and she walked toward Maya's car with purpose. Maya could tell this wasn't going to be a typical stop. The officer reached the window, standing straight and tall as she looked down at Maya. "License and registration," the officer demanded, her voice harsh and commanding. Maya didn't hesitate to reach for her purse. As she handed over her documents, she couldn't help but notice the officer's cold, piercing gaze. Maya smiled politely, hoping to ease the tension. "I'm sorry, officer. Is there a problem? I wasn't speeding, and I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't respond to her words. Instead, she snatched the documents from Maya's hand and began inspecting them with a scrutinizing look. Maya waited in silence, feeling increasingly uncomfortable under the officer's gaze. After a long, awkward pause, the officer spoke again, but her tone was sharp. "Step out of the vehicle." Maya's heart sank. "What? Why?" she asked, feeling confused and increasingly uneasy. "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, her voice colder this time. There was no explanation, no justification for the order. Maya hesitated, her mind racing. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal. Why? With no choice but to comply, Maya slowly opened the door and stepped out of the SUV. The officer motioned for her to stand in front of the vehicle, her expression still stern. Maya's thoughts spun in circles. What was happening here? Was she being targeted? She'd been pulled over by officers before, but this situation felt different. The officer wasn't even offering any kind of explanation. There was no kindness in her eyes, no sense of politeness or professionalism. It was almost as though she was looking for a reason to make this encounter difficult. "Please, officer, can you explain what this is about?" Maya asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The officer didn't answer. Instead, she began to walk around Maya, inspecting her vehicle as if looking for something to pin on her. Maya couldn't understand what was going on. She had done everything by the book. She hadn't broken any laws, hadn't been speeding, hadn't been acting suspiciously. So why was this happening? Suddenly, the officer returned to stand directly in front of her. Maya could see the tension in the officer's face, as though she had already made up her mind about something. The officer's eyes flicked down to Maya's clothing and then back up to her face, judging her silently. Maya's hand started to tremble slightly, though she tried to hide it. She was no stranger to feeling uncomfortable in situations like this, but there was something in the officer's demeanor that made her nervous. It felt like the officer was more interested in her race than her actions. Then the officer spoke again, and this time her words caught Maya completely off guard. "You're under arrest," she said bluntly. Maya blinked, unable to process what was happening. What? Why? What did I do? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Arrested? For what? She had done nothing wrong. The officer didn't respond, merely pulling out a pair of handcuffs from her belt. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't understand how this was happening. Was it a mistake? Was this some kind of joke? But as the officer moved forward, Maya realized this wasn't a joke. Her body went cold as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around her wrists. Maya stood frozen, her mind racing. How had things escalated so quickly? What had she done to deserve this? Why was the officer treating her this way? Maya felt the cold sting of the metal cuffs as the officer roughly guided her to the police car. She couldn't believe what was happening. Her mind raced in disbelief as the officer didn't say another word. It all felt like a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. She glanced around at the busy street, wondering if anyone had seen what was happening. Why wasn't anyone stepping in to help? As the officer opened the door of the police car, Maya was shoved inside. The cold leather seats of the patrol car felt uncomfortable against her skin. She tried to remain calm, but a sense of dread began to wash over her. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into something much darker. Why was she being arrested? What had she done to deserve this treatment? Her thoughts were a jumble of confusion and anger. The officer slammed the door shut, and Maya sat alone in the back seat, struggling to make sense of everything. Her heart pounded in her chest as the police car slowly started to pull away from the curb. The sounds of the city outside seemed to fade into the distance, and all that remained was the heavy silence inside the car. Maya was still trying to process what had just happened when the officer's voice broke through her thoughts. "You're being arrested for suspicion of fraud," the officer stated, her voice flat and emotionless. Maya blinked in surprise. "Fraud? That doesn't make any sense. I haven't done anything wrong." She was nearly shouting now, her voice tinged with panic. The officer didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention to the road ahead, her hands firmly gripping the steering wheel. Maya could feel the weight of the situation settling in. Fraud. Why would the officer even think she had committed fraud? Maya had no criminal record, no history of any kind of wrongdoing. She was simply a businesswoman trying to get to an important meeting. As the car turned onto the highway, Maya's mind continued to race. She thought back to the moment when the officer had first approached her vehicle. The way the officer had looked at her, with such cold judgment, was still fresh in her mind. It wasn't just the way the officer spoke to her. It was her entire demeanor. Maya had felt like she was being judged for something she couldn't control. Her skin color. Could this have been some form of racial profiling? It was a question that Maya couldn't shake, even though she didn't want to believe it. She had heard about these kinds of injustices before, but never imagined she would experience it herself. She wasn't the first person to be unfairly targeted because of their race. But now, sitting in the back of that patrol car, Maya was starting to feel the harsh reality of it. The drive to the police station felt like it took forever. Maya stared out the window, trying to calm herself. She had to figure out a way to get out of this. There had to be a mistake. She was going to prove her innocence. She just needed to remain calm and stay focused. When they finally arrived at the station, Maya was led inside and placed in a holding cell. The cold, hard walls around her seemed to close in as she stood there, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. How long would she be stuck here? Was this really happening? The officer who had arrested her didn't offer any words of explanation as she locked the door behind Maya and walked away. Maya was left alone, her mind racing, wondering what had gone wrong. She needed to know more, needed to find out why this was happening to her. As she stood there, struggling to come to terms with everything, She overheard the two officers who had been talking outside her cell. Their voices drifted in through the bars, and Maya caught a snippet of their conversation. "It's not right. She doesn't belong in here." "This is going too far," one of the officers said. The other officer replied, "I don't care. She's a criminal, and she's getting what she deserves." Maya's ears perked up. "What do you mean by that?" she thought. "Criminal? What criminal charges are they talking about?" She was now more confused than ever. Someone had made the decision to treat her like a criminal, but she wasn't sure why. All she knew was that something didn't feel right, and it felt like it was all because of the way she looked. Maya sat quietly in the cold holding cell, her mind still racing. She had no idea how much longer she would be stuck here, or what was going to happen next. Every minute felt like an hour as she stared at the bare walls around her, trying to find a way out of this mess. But despite all her thoughts, one thing became painfully clear: she was being treated unfairly. Hours passed, and Maya was left alone with her thoughts. She had been trying to stay calm, but now her frustration was growing. The more she thought about the officer's actions, the more she felt certain that this wasn't a simple case of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. There was something more to this, something deeper. The weight of the situation started to sink in. Was she really being arrested on suspicion of fraud, or was this something more sinister? Was this officer, this woman, really arresting her because of her race? Maya had heard of these kinds of situations happening to others, but she had never imagined it would happen to her. But now, everything seemed to point to the fact that this wasn't just a routine stop. It was personal. Maya's thoughts were interrupted when the door to the cell suddenly opened. She looked up, startled, as a new officer stepped inside. Unlike the officer who had arrested her, this one looked more relaxed, his uniform a little less stiff. He wasn't carrying the same cold expression. In fact, he looked almost apologetic as he approached. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, though his voice was firm. Maya, still reeling from everything, nodded slowly. "I don't know. I don't understand what's happening. Why am I here? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer paused for a moment before speaking again. "I know this doesn't make sense to you, but there's something you need to understand. This arrest, it's based on something more than just a routine stop." Maya's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? Why am I being treated like this?" The officer hesitated, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I'm not sure what's going on, but the officer who arrested you, she's got a history of targeting people like you. I've seen her pull the same stunt with other people, making assumptions, treating them like criminals without any reason. It's wrong, and it needs to stop. But I'm going to help you." Maya's heart skipped a beat. Was this officer admitting that she had been targeted because of her race? She couldn't believe it, but at the same time, it felt like everything was starting to make sense. The way the first officer had looked at her, the coldness in her voice, it wasn't just because of her driving. It was because of who she was. "I don't know how far this goes, but you need to know something," the officer continued. "That officer doesn't know who you really are. She doesn't know what you've accomplished or what you mean to this community." Maya's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? What am I supposed to be?" The officer leaned closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "You're not just any woman. You're a state senator." Maya blinked in disbelief. A state senator. She had to repeat the words in her head to make sure she was hearing them correctly. She wasn't just an ordinary citizen. She was a state senator. She was being arrested, humiliated, and treated like a criminal without the officer even knowing who she really was. Maya couldn't help but laugh bitterly. A state senator. She didn't even know that. "I can't believe this." The officer nodded solemnly. "I know it's hard to believe, but that's what's going on. You've worked hard to get where you are, and now, this officer is trying to ruin that." Maya's heart sank. She had worked so hard to earn her position, to fight for change in her community. She never imagined that her success would one day make her a target. Suspense hook. Maya was released from the holding room, the officer who had promised to help her leading the way. The feeling of cold metal cuffs being removed from her wrists was a small but comforting relief. But even as the cuffs were taken off, a different weight hung over her, a weight that only grew heavier the more she thought about what had happened. She had been unjustly arrested. Racism had been a factor. And now, she had to fight back, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been wrongly accused or treated unfairly because of their race. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing an ugly truth that the system wanted to sweep under the rug. "Stay close," the officer said, his voice low and serious. Maya nodded, the determination in her eyes clear. She wasn't about to back down. As they walked down the hallway to the exit of the police station, Maya's thoughts swirled. She could still feel the sting of the officer's cold treatment, her mind replaying the harsh words and actions from earlier. But more than that, she felt a rising fire inside her. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had faced discrimination, every person who had been targeted by the system for reasons beyond their control. Maya knew that she had to make a stand. They stepped out into the crisp night air, and the officer led Maya to a discreet car parked on the side of the building. The quiet hum of the city outside only made the weight of the situation feel more intense. Maya was being driven away from the place that had once been a safe space for her, but now felt like a reminder of all the injustices she had faced. "Where are we going?" Maya asked, glancing at the officer as he started the engine. "We need to keep a low profile for now," he replied, his eyes focused on the road. "The last thing we want is for the officer who arrested you to know we're onto her. We need to be strategic about this." Maya nodded. She understood. They needed to gather evidence, to make sure they had everything they needed to expose the officer's actions before she could cover her tracks. As they drove through the city, Maya's mind was filled with 100 questions. How would they gather the proof? What if the officer didn't have any past complaints? What if Maya had no choice but to go public with her story, risking everything? Her thoughts were interrupted as the officer spoke again, his voice serious. "I got some leads, Maya. There's a group of people who've experienced similar treatment. If we can get them to come forward, we'll have a stronger case. But it's not going to be easy. You need to be prepared for a fight." Maya took a deep breath. A fight. She was no stranger to that. Every step of her career had been a fight against doubt, against the people who tried to tear her down because of her race. But this was different. This was a fight against something far more dangerous, corruption in the system. "I'm ready," Maya said, her voice steady. "I've been ready for this. I've fought for change my whole life. This won't be any different." The officer gave her a brief nod of approval, though his face remained serious. "It's not just about the police department. It's about making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen to anyone else. If we win this, we'll send a message, and people will start taking notice." Maya could feel the weight of his words. They weren't just talking about an isolated incident. This was bigger than one corrupt officer. This was about the system that allowed officers like her to get away with discrimination. It was about the culture of racism that still lurked in places like this. As the car turned onto a quiet street, Maya's thoughts shifted to her next move. She needed to talk to the people who could help her. The witnesses, the people who had experienced similar treatment. But she couldn't do it alone. She needed a team, a group of allies who understood the fight she was about to take on. They arrived at a small, inconspicuous building on the outskirts of town. The officer led Maya inside, where a small group of people was waiting. They looked nervous, but there was a sense of determination in the air. "This is where the real work begins," the officer said as they walked inside. "These people have been through it too, and they're ready to help you." Maya took a deep breath and looked around the room. She knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult road, but she was ready. She had no other choice. Too many people had suffered in silence. Too many had been wronged. Now, It was her turn to make a stand. Maya couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. As she sat in the small, dimly lit room with the group of people who would come forward to support her, she realized just how dangerous the road ahead was. These were people who had been hurt by the system, people who had faced unjust treatment, just like her. But in order to fight back, they would have to expose everything: the lies, the discrimination, the abuse of power. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, her heart racing as she saw an unknown number on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her hand trembling slightly. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maya, it's Officer Daniels," the voice on the other end of the line said. "The officer who had helped her, who had promised to get her out of this mess. We need to talk. It's urgent." Maya's pulse quickened. Something didn't feel right. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting to the others in the room, who were listening intently. "It's not safe. The officer who arrested you, she's onto us," Officer Daniels replied, his voice low. "We've just found out that she's been digging into your background, trying to find anything she can use against you. She's got connections, Maya. She's going to fight back, and we're running out of time." Maya's mind raced. This wasn't just about the officer anymore. It was about the whole system coming down on her. She had known the stakes were high, but now she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her with every passing minute. The enemy was closer than she had thought. "Where are you right now?" Officer Daniels asked. "I'm at a safe place, a building on the outskirts of town. We're gathering evidence," Maya replied, trying to remain calm. "I'll be there soon," he said before quickly hanging up. Maya stood up, her fingers tightening around the phone. She looked at the people in the room. The weight of what was happening was beginning to sink in. They were in this together, but the more they dug, the more dangerous it became. She had never expected this battle to be easy, but the walls were closing in faster than she could have imagined. "What's going on?" one of the men in the room asked, his voice tinged with worry. "Is everything okay?" Maya swallowed hard, her throat dry. "No, the officer who arrested me is trying to fight back. She's digging into my past, looking for anything that could discredit me or make this whole thing fall apart." The group exchanged worried glances. It wasn't just Maya's life on the line. It was theirs too. If the officer was able to turn the tables, they could all be dragged into this fight, each one of them becoming targets in a system that didn't want to change. "We can't let her do this," Maya said, her voice steadying as she stood tall. "We have to stay ahead of her. We need more evidence. We can't let her destroy everything we've worked for." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone absorbed the gravity of what she had just said. It was time to step up the fight. But how? They needed more than just words. They needed something concrete to expose the officer's actions. At that moment, Maya's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Officer Daniels. "Urgent. Meet me at the warehouse. I've got something that could turn everything around. Be careful." Maya's heart skipped a beat. The warehouse. It sounded like the kind of place where no one would ask questions, and it was clear that Officer Daniels was taking the huge risk by meeting her there. But if he had something that could turn the case in their favor, she couldn't waste any time. "I'm going to meet him," Maya said, her voice firm. "We have to make sure this officer can't get away with this. I'm not backing down now." The group nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They knew what was at stake, and they were willing to follow her to the end of this fight. As Maya stepped out into the night, she couldn't help but wonder how far she was willing to go to win. How much was she willing to sacrifice? This fight was about more than just exposing one officer's racism. It was about proving that the system could change, that no one should ever be treated the way she had been. The streets were quiet as she drove toward the warehouse, but Maya could feel the tension in the air. It was as though every shadow held a secret, every street corner hid a potential danger. She had made a lot of enemies in the last few hours, and she knew that the walls were closing in on her. Maya pulled into the deserted warehouse parking lot, her headlights cutting through the darkness. The towering structure loomed before her, its windows dark and lifeless, as if it were hiding secrets in every crevice. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Something about this place felt wrong. She had been here before, but never in a situation like this, never with everything on the line. Her mind raced as she parked the car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. What if Officer Daniels had been compromised? What if this wasn't a safe meeting at all? She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. The cold night air nipped at her skin, but it was the uncertainty gnawing at her that made her shiver. She scanned the parking lot quickly. No sign of anyone. No shadows lurking around. But something didn't feel right. Maya glanced at her phone one last time, checking for any new messages. Nothing. The only message was the one she'd received earlier. Urgent. Meet me at the warehouse. I've got something that could turn everything around. Be careful. She pushed the phone back into her pocket and took another cautious step forward. The warehouse stood silent, its vast metal doors closed, hiding whatever lay inside. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space as she moved toward the entrance. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind a stack of wooden crates. Maya froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it Officer Daniels? Or was it a trap? Maya. A voice called out in the darkness, and Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was Daniel's voice, but something in it sounded off. She couldn't quite place it, but the usual warmth and trust she'd felt with him were gone, replaced with something colder, more distant. "I'm here," she said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. The figure stepped closer, emerging from the shadows. It was Daniels, but his expression was unreadable. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, and there was a nervous edge to his movements. The kind of nervousness that made Maya's instincts scream that something was wrong. "You're late," Daniels said, his tone curt. Maya's eyes narrowed. Something wasn't right. She didn't like the way he was acting. She had trusted him, believed in him, but now her doubt was creeping in. She had to stay alert. "What's going on, Daniels?" Maya asked, her voice sharp. "You said you had something important to show me. Where is it?" He glanced around quickly, as though making sure no one was watching. "Follow me," he said, and turned without waiting for her response. Maya hesitated but followed him, her footsteps light as she tried to stay as far behind him as possible without making it obvious. She knew the layout of the warehouse. It wasn't a place where anyone would hear you if things went wrong. It was the perfect spot for someone to disappear, or for a trap to be set. They reached a small office at the back of the warehouse. Daniels opened the door, and Maya stepped inside, immediately feeling the chill of the room. It was dark, only the faintest sliver of light from a single lamp hanging above a desk. Papers were scattered across the desk, and files lay open on the floor. It looked like someone had been rummaging through the place in a hurry. "Where's the evidence?" Maya demanded, her patience wearing thin. "What do you have that can help me?" Daniels turned around slowly, a faint smirk on his lips. "You really think you can just waltz in here and expect everything to be handed to you?" He sneered, his eyes now cold and calculating. "This isn't a game, Maya." Her blood ran cold. The tone in his voice was no longer friendly. It was threatening. Everything in her mind screamed that this was no longer the officer she had trusted. This was someone else entirely. "Wait, what are you talking about?" Maya asked, her voice shaky now. But she wasn't backing down. "You promised you would help me." He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, and for a moment, Maya thought she saw something in his eyes, a flash of recognition, something that told her this man was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "I never promised anything," Daniels replied, his voice now low and menacing. "You were just a pawn in my game. I never cared about your little crusade. I just needed you to get close enough to reveal your identity. Now that we've got what we need, it's over." Maya's heart raced as the pieces fell into place. She had been played. Daniels wasn't her ally. He had been working against her from the start, feeding her false information and leading her into this trap. She had trusted him, and now she was paying the price. Maya's thoughts raced. She had to act fast. She couldn't let him get away with this. The lives of the people who had trusted her were on the line. She couldn't allow this to be the end of everything. "I won't let you win," Maya said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't be part of your game." With that, she spun around and bolted toward the door, but Daniels was quicker. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "Let go of me," Maya shouted, her heart pounding in her chest. But Daniels didn't let go. Instead, he dragged her back into the room and slammed the door shut behind them. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she struggled against Officer Daniels' iron grip. Her mind raced, her body fighting with everything it had left. This wasn't supposed to be how it ended. She had come too far, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to let a corrupt officer take it all away. "Let me go," she shouted, but her voice only echoed in the dark, empty warehouse. Daniel's grip tightened, and she could feel the cold sweat on her brow. "You should have stayed out of it, Maya," Daniel sneered, his face cold and unforgiving. "This was never about justice for you. It was always about silencing you before you caused more trouble than you're worth." Maya's mind spun as she tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. How had she not seen it sooner? How had she trusted him? But there was no time to dwell on those thoughts. She had to get out. She had to fight. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had been festering in the system for years. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Maya stomped hard on Daniel's foot, causing him to stumble back in pain. It was enough to break his hold on her for just a second. Seizing the opportunity, Maya dashed for the door, but as she reached the handle, she heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Her body froze in fear as she slowly turned to face Daniels. "You really thought you could just walk away from this?" he hissed, his hand gripping the pistol with a deadly certainty. "You've made things a lot worse for yourself. And now, I'm going to finish what I started." Maya's breath caught in her throat as the barrel of the gun was aimed squarely at her chest. Her mind raced. Was this it? Would this corrupt officer take everything from her? She couldn't let this happen. Not like this. "Do you really think this is the way to win?" Maya asked, her voice trembling but strong, as she faced him down. "The truth always comes out, Daniels, no matter how hard you try to bury it." Daniels laughed darkly. "You think I care about the truth? The only truth that matters is that I'm in control now. I don't need to explain myself to anyone, especially not you." Maya's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this. She couldn't die here. Not after everything she'd been through. Not when she was so close to exposing the corruption that had kept her and so many others oppressed for far too long. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine roared outside the warehouse, followed by the screech of tires. Maya's heart skipped a beat. Was it help? Was someone finally coming for her? She didn't have time to wait for an answer. With a surge of adrenaline, Maya lunged toward Daniels, knocking the gun out of his hand. The weapon skidded across the floor, out of reach. But Daniels wasn't done yet. He lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and slamming her against the wall. Maya gasped for breath as her head thudded against the cold, hard surface. The pain was sharp, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had to keep fighting. She had to stay strong. Just as Daniels raised his hand to strike her, the door to the warehouse burst open, and two more officers rushed in, guns drawn. "Freeze!" one of the officers shouted, pointing his weapon at Daniels. "Let her go now." Daniels froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden arrival. Maya saw her chance and pushed with everything she had, knocking Daniels to the side just as he turned to face the new threat. "What's going on here?" One of the officers asked, his voice filled with authority. "We got a call from a witness. There's been a complaint filed against Officer Daniels for misconduct." Daniels' face twisted in shock and anger, but he didn't say a word. He knew it was over. He knew his game had come to an end. The officers quickly moved in to arrest him, taking his gun and securing him in handcuffs. Maya stood there, her body still shaking, but her mind was racing. It was finally over. Daniels was being taken away, and his corruption was being exposed for the world to see. The fight was over, but the battle for justice was far from done. This was only one victory in a much bigger war that still needed to be fought. The officer who had been helping her, Officer Williams, stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. Maya nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm okay. Thanks to you." "We couldn't have done it without you," Williams said, offering her a reassuring smile. "You're the reason we were able to stop this before it went any further." Maya's heart swelled with gratitude, but she knew this wasn't the end. She had exposed one corrupt officer, but there were more out there. She knew she had to keep going. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't stop until the system had been changed, until the truth was finally allowed to come to light. As the officers led Daniels away in cuffs, Maya watched, knowing that her fight had just begun. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. She had allies, and together, they could make a difference.